Welcome back to Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play the first volume of the fast action battle game series, The Bulge. FAB, The Bulge, was released in 2008 by G&T Games and designed by Rick Young. This game supports up to 2 players and takes about 4 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. Another way you can support the channel is by liking and subscribing. Liking a video helps me understand what content is successful with this audience. As for subscribing, new content appears on this channel first. While you may have found your way here from Board Game Geek or other sites, in the future I'll also be adding more exclusive content that may only be found here. The best way to be informed when I upload new videos is to subscribe and click the bell icon for notifications. Once again, thanks for watching, and now let's get to the video. At last, we've arrived at the supply phase. In this phase, both of the players are involved in each of the following steps, and they may resolve their portions simultaneously. First, players verify the control of areas. Next, they determine supply status and adjust disordered markers. And finally, they perform morale checks for the phasing player's unsupplied units and remove appropriate markers. Let's walk through each of these steps to see the requirements. In the first step, verify control of areas, both players check each area to verify that control is intuitively clear. Otherwise, the area is marked by a control marker from the appropriate side. Remember, in vacant areas, the last sole occupant of that area has control. Next, each player determines supply status and then adjusts disordered markers. In the first part of this step, each unit is checked to see that it has a viable supply source. In the Bulge, supply sources are each side's entry areas. For the Germans, this is entry areas X through Z. For the Allies, it's entry areas A through Q. A supply path is traced from a friendly unit or friendly controlled area towards any valid supply source. In this case, friendly entry areas. Naturally, there are restrictions. A supply path may only be traced over a blown bridge if the tracing unit begins in an area adjacent to it. A supply path may be traced out of enemy-controlled areas, but never into or through them. And a path is always traced into and through occupied friendly controlled areas regardless of enemy units. If a unit is unable to trace a path back to supply, then add an unsupplied marker to them. For previously unsupplied units, if they can now trace a path to a supply source, remove the unsupplied markers. In the second part of this step, players adjust their units' disordered markers. For all disordered and recovering units that are able to trace a supply path, both players remove all recovering markers and then flip disorder markers over to their recovering side. Therefore, it takes 2 supply phases to completely remove a disordered marker. When a unit has an unsupplied and/or disordered marker, they have the following restrictions. Units may only move one area during a movement phase. Unsupplied units may not build field works or be placed in reserve. They have a -1 success number modifier when firing and when making a morale check. These modifiers are cumulative when a unit is both unsupplied and disordered. Units with a disordered marker may not attack. However, it may defend with a -1 to its success number modifier. Units with an unsupplied marker may not have any assets assigned, and they must make a morale check at the end of the friendly supply phase, with failure causing a unit to become either disordered, lose 1 step, or surrender. Surrender means they're eliminated. Disordered markers may not be favorably adjusted, which means recovery is stalled. and areas and units may not be affected by friendly events, special actions, staff functions, or engineering functions. Now, let's talk about morale checks for unsupplied units. The phasing player only performs a morale check with a -1 unsupplied success number modifier for his units that are unsupplied. Units that fail this check that are not yet disordered become disordered. Units that fail this check that are already disordered suffer a step loss. Veteran disordered units that roll a 10 or green disordered units that roll an 8 through 10 surrender and are eliminated regardless of remaining steps. Disordered units with a current troop quality of elite do not surrender, though they still suffer a step loss with a failed morale check if disordered. In the final step of the supply phase, it's time to remove appropriate markers. Remove all fieldworks markers that are in contested areas, then roadblocks and all defended roadblocks. Remove all river assault markers and any exploitation markers. And finally, remove all of the non-phasing players' reserve markers, but leave the phasing player's reserve markers. The phasing player still has until the next turn to spend the reserve marker during the reaction phase. And now that the supply phase is complete, it's time to check for victory. As we saw way back in the first episode, players earn victory points by securing objective areas, identified by having one or more of the VP symbols within the area, and eliminating large enemy units with 3 or more steps. Following the supply phase, it's now time to calculate victory points and determine if there's a sudden death victory. Players do not perform this step for the first 3 turns. They merely advance the game turn marker and play through another turn. Beginning with turn 4, the turn record chart shows what is needed in terms of net victory points to end the game. If the advantage player's VP level is greater than or equal to the player's net VP value for the turn, that player wins a sudden death victory. If a sudden death victory does not occur, play proceeds to the next game turn. Next, before we close out this episode, let's look at special actions and staff functions. Special actions come in 2 types: reusable blocks and single-use counters. The reusable special action block represents a player's personal command influence and may affect units of any friendly higher echelon. Once spent, they are moved to the use box, and then automatically return to the available box during the reinforcement phase, thus bypassing the selection cup process. The single-use special action counters represent the command influence of higher echelon commanders and may only affect units in that group. These counters are played in the game as events, which are then placed in the eliminated box. However, when playing a special action as an event, it does not count against the 1 event allowed per battle. Therefore, you can play a special action and still use artillery or play another event. Now, either of these game piece types can be spent to perform 7 different special actions throughout the game turn. Let's walk through each of them. A special action can be played to reroute a reinforcing unit during the reinforcement phase. This allows one reinforcing unit to be placed in any friendly controlled or vacant enemy controlled appropriate entry area. A special action can also be played to acquire quality replacements during the admin phase. This allows the owning player to select a supplied reduced unit, either an infantry or armor unit, to receive 1 step of replacements, even if the replacement step is elite. Next, a special action can be spent to rally the troops during the admin phase. This allows the player to designate any one supplied area. All friendly units marked as disordered or recovering within the designated area, and all adjacent areas recover fully and have their disordered and recovering markers removed. As we saw in the last episode, a special action can be spent to reinforce in battle or retreat before combat. A special action can also be spent to conduct breakthrough movement. This allows one supplied armor class unit in good order that has not yet moved this phase to move in the breakthrough movement phase, basically allowing it to move as if it had an exploitation marker, which means it can move to an adjacent area. And finally, a special action can be spent to conduct breakthrough combat. This allows one already contested area to have another round of combat fought in it during the friendly breakthrough combat phase. This area may not have already fought a round of combat during the breakthrough combat phase, so you can't have a third round of combat. And those are the special actions. Now, let's look at staff functions. The command staff asset represents a player's headquarters staff working in the background in an ongoing effort to uncover additional resources. The command staff asset, when in the available box, may be used to perform any one of the following staff functions during the admin phase. And these staff functions can be performed with no higher echelon restrictions. Once the staff function is completed, the command staff asset is placed in the use box and recycled like any other asset. There are 3 staff functions. First, a replacement can be found. This allows one step of non-elite replacements that may be added to any supplied infantry class unit. Next, intelligence gathering. The player chooses any one enemy unit anywhere on the map and in any supply status, which is then revealed until the end of the admin phase. And finally, reserves made available. This allows a player to mark any eligible unit with an appropriate and available reserve marker. Now, for the Bulge, there are also 2 additional staff functions exclusive to each side. For the Americans, there's the asset pooled for crucial battle. With this staff function, one area may be designated in the admin phase for pooled assets. First, mark the area with the pooled assets marker. Then, throughout that player turn, the restrictions on assets only being able to support units of their own army and the restrictions on units from mixed higher echelons are lifted for the Americans in the designated area. This marker is later removed during the supply phase of the current player turn. For the German player, they have an additional staff function for a pre-authorized boundary crossing. Each time this function is selected, one German unit may depart its army zone without paying 2 additional movement points. When this staff function is used, mark the unit with a boundary crossing marker, which is removed after the unit's next move or in the next friendly supply phase, whichever occurs first. Keep these rules in mind when using special actions and staff functions. And now that we've covered the supply phase and looked at special actions and staff functions, you should now be ready to begin your own game of the Bulge. And after you've mastered the Bulge, remember there's a whole series of fast action battle games. All games in this series use a common set of rules, with a separate playbook for rules specific to that entry. So you're well over halfway to learning to play those games as well. So make sure you're subscribed with notifications because in the future, we may cover these games as well. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.